You wake up and reach for the object beside your bed before your own name returns to you. A glass screen lights your face in the dark. News, approval, fear, desire, deadlines. You have not moved, but the world has already entered you. Somewhere across the planet, millions of others perform the exact same motion at the exact same moment. 2,000 years ago, a group called the Gnostics warned that the world would not feel like a prison when the trap was perfected. They said it would feel normal, comfortable, addictive. They said the bars would be invisible. They said the guards would look like gods. And then they said the prisoners would defend the system that feeds on them. This is not the story of angels and demons. This is the story of how a cage learns to call itself reality, and how a few tried to escape it. If this world is a trap, why does it feel like home? The alarm sounds at 6:47 a.m. Not because you chose that time through deliberate consideration of your body's natural rhythms, but because it allows exactly enough margin to shower, dress, consume caffeine, and arrive at your designated location with 3 minutes to spare. You will repeat this sequence approximately 250 times this year. The pattern has become so deeply encoded that your body begins the stress response 4 minutes before the alarm sounds. Before your feet touch the floor, you have already checked 3 platforms: email, messages, the feed. Each ping releases a microshot of dopamine, the same neurochemical that once rewarded your ancestors for finding food and water. Now it rewards you for finding notifications. The ratio of effort to reward has been optimized to a degree that would make a casino designer weep with envy. You're not unusual, you're precisely average, and that is the point. The word normal comes from the Latin norma, meaning a carpenter's square, a tool for enforcing right angles, for making certain that every plank conforms to every other plank. When we say something is normal, we mean it fits the pattern. When we say someone is normal, we mean they have accepted the angle. In 1945, archaeologists working near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi discovered a sealed jar containing 13 leather-bound codices. These texts, written in Coptic and dating to the 3rd and 4th centuries, contained some of the most sophisticated psychological and cosmological literature of the ancient world. Among them was a collection of writings that described the material universe not as a divine creation, but as a sophisticated enclosure, what they called the kenoma, the emptiness, the deficiency. The Gnostic position was not that matter itself was evil, it was that matter had been weaponized, organized, turned into a system of recursive entrapment where every apparent pleasure concealed a hook, every satisfaction contained the seed of new hunger, and every achievement simply reset the baseline for what would be required next. Consider your relationship. With money, you need a certain amount to survive: food, shelter, basic security. But the moment that threshold is reached, a new threshold appears. Comfort, then status, then legacy. The goalpost recedes at exactly the pace you approach it. This is not accidental, this is architectural. The Gnostic texts describe the material world as a place where hunger is not a bug, but a feature, where satisfaction is always temporary, where every answer generates 3 new questions, where peace is always one purchase, one promotion, one relationship away. They called this the archontic system. The archons, from the Greek archon, meaning ruler or authority, were described not as mythological demons but as systemic intelligences, patterns of control embedded so deeply into the fabric of material existence that they became invisible. Like a fish unaware of water, humans were said to swim in a medium of subtle coercion without recognizing it as anything other than nature. You wake, you work, you consume, you rest, you repeat. The cycle is not forced upon you. You choose it. Every morning you choose it. And this is what makes it perfect. A cage that requires guards is expensive. A cage that locks from the inside is free. The ancient expectation of what a prison should feel like involved obvious suffering, chains, darkness, pain. The Gnostic inversion was to suggest that the most effective prison would feel like freedom, that the most sophisticated control system would be one where the inhabitants police themselves, where desire itself became the warden, where the very act of seeking happiness tightened the restraints. You are in debt, so you work harder. Working harder generates stress, so you consume to relieve it. Consumption requires money, so you go deeper into debt. The loop is closed, the system is stable, and at no point did anyone hold a gun to your head. Psychological research in the 20th and 21st centuries has identified this pattern under different names: the hedonic treadmill, operant conditioning, variable ratio reinforcement schedules. The language has changed, but the observation remains. Human behavior can be shaped with extraordinary precision by controlling the relationship between action and reward. Slot machines pay out just often enough to keep the gambler seated. Social media platforms deliver just enough validation to keep you scrolling. Dating apps provide just enough possibility to keep you swiping. The underlying mathematics are identical, the neurochemistry is identical. Only the interface has changed. In the hypostasis of the archons, one of the Nag Hammadi texts, the material world is described as a place where humans are kept in a state of perpetual distraction, not through overt violence, but through the constant presentation of objects of desire. The text suggests that the controllers of this system understand a simple principle. A human who is chasing something does not have time to ask why they are chasing it. Look at your own day. How much of it is spent in genuine stillness? Not the forced stillness of exhaustion, but the chosen stillness of non-doing? For most people, the answer is zero. Every moment is filled. Podcasts during the commute, music during the workout, television during meals, scrolling during any gap longer than 30 seconds. The Gnostics would have recognized this immediately. They called it the sleep of forgetfulness, not literal unconsciousness, but a state where you are so busy performing the motions of life that you never pause to ask what life is for. You're free to choose your job, your apartment, and your partner, your entertainment, but you're not free to choose whether to participate in the system that requires jobs, apartments, partners, and entertainment. That choice was made before you arrived. The fundamental structure is non-negotiable. You can select the color of your cell, but not whether to be in a cell. And this raises the central question that drives everything that follows. If the system is this comprehensive, this invisible, this self-reinforcing, who designed it? The Gnostics had an answer. It was not the answer anyone expected. In the traditional cosmology of the Abrahamic religions, God is presented as omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient, all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing. This creates what philosophers call the problem of evil. If God possesses all three attributes, why does suffering exist? Various theological frameworks have attempted to resolve this contradiction through concepts like free will, soul building, or divine mystery. The Gnostic texts take a different approach. They suggest the problem is not philosophical but factual. The God of this world is not all-loving. The God of this world is not even particularly competent. The God of this world is the narcissist with a control problem. In the Apocryphon of John, one of the central Gnostic scriptures, the creator of the material world is not the ultimate divine source, but a derivative being called the demiurge, literally the craftsman or public worker in Greek. This entity does not emerge from intentional divine creation, but from an error, a rupture, a cosmic mistake. And crucially, it does not know it is derivative. The demiurge looks around at the material world it has fashioned and declares, "I am God, and there is no other." This is not a statement of fact, it is a statement of ignorance. The text presents this declaration as both tragic and absurd. A middle manager convinced it is the CEO, a subroutine convinced it is the programmer. But the demiurge's ignorance does not make it powerless. Within the material realm, it has absolute authority, and it uses that authority in a very specific way, through fear, through punishment, and through the establishment of a system where obedience is the only currency that matters. Read the Old Testament with this framework and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The God of Genesis creates humans and immediately forbids them access to knowledge. When they disobey, the punishment is not correction but exile and generational curse. The God of Exodus demands absolute loyalty and responds to disobedience with plagues, mass death, and collective punishment. The God of Leviticus establishes a legal system so complex and detailed that perfection is structurally impossible, ensuring permanent guilt. This is not theology. This is behavioral psychology. In modern clinical terms, the demiurge exhibits every characteristic of what is now called narcissistic personality disorder, with authoritarian features, grandiosity, need for total control, inability to tolerate dissent, punishment-based reinforcement, love that is conditional upon performance, rage when questioned. The dynamic between the demiurge and humanity mirrors precisely the dynamic between an abusive authority figure and a dependent population. Obey, and you may be rewarded. Disobey, and you'll certainly be punished. Questioning the legitimacy of the authority itself is the greatest transgression, because it threatens the entire structure. Consider the central mechanism of most fear-based religious systems: sin, guilt, confession, temporary absolution, inevitable return to sin. The cycle is identical to what psychologists call trauma bonding in abusive relationships. The abuser creates the wound, offers the bandage, then creates the wound again. The victim becomes dependent on the abuser for relief from the very pain the abuser inflicts. You're born broken. You're told you are broken by the one who broke you. You're offered repair, but only through total submission. The repair is always temporary. The brokenness is always your fault. In the second treatise of the Great Seth, another Gnostic text, this system is described explicitly. The Archons thought they were establishing order, but they were establishing a prison. They thought they were creating law, but they were creating chains. The genius of the system is that the prisoner comes to identify with the prison. You internalize the voice of the authority. It becomes your own voice. You no longer need an external enforcer because you have become the enforcer. The guard tower is now inside your skull. This is where the Gnostic critique becomes genuinely dangerous to institutional religion. Because if the God of this world is not the ultimate God, then the entire priesthood claiming to speak for that God is either deceived or complicit. Every church built in the demiurge's name is a reinforcement of the cage. Every prayer directed toward the demiurge is a strengthening of the bars. Obedience becomes the highest virtue not because it leads to enlightenment, but because it stabilizes the system. Submission is not a path to God, it is a path to continued imprisonment. The psychological literature on authoritarian control structures confirms this pattern across cultures and time periods, whether the authority is religious, political, or familial. The mechanisms are identical: establish absolute power, make love conditional, punish dissent, reward conformity, and ensure that the subject never develops an internal locus of control. An internal locus of control means you believe you're the author of your own life. An external locus of control means you believe you're subject to forces beyond your influence. Every authoritarian system works to cultivate external locus of control. Every liberatory system works to cultivate internal locus. The demiurge cannot afford for you to discover your own authority, because the moment you do, its authority evaporates. But here is where the trap becomes truly sophisticated. The demiurge does not need to monitor you constantly. It simply needs to install the monitoring system inside you and let you do the rest. It needs to make you afraid of your own thoughts. It needs to make you police your own desires. It needs to make you confess your own transgressions, not to receive forgiveness, but to continually reinforce the idea that transgression is who you are. Guilt is the most efficient prison guard ever devised. It requires no salary, it never sleeps, it never goes on vacation, and it convinces you that its presence is proof of your moral development rather than evidence of your ongoing captivity. The confessional booth and the smartphone are separated by centuries, but they operate on identical principles. Both create a space where you voluntarily reveal your interior life to an external system. Both generate a sense of temporary relief followed by renewed anxiety. Both transform private experience into data that can be monitored, judged, and used to modify behavior. In medieval Christianity, the practice of confession became mandatory in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council. Every Christian was required to confess their sins to a priest at least once per year. This was not framed as an option. It was framed as a spiritual necessity. The stated purpose was the health of the soul. The functional purpose was the creation of a surveillance system where every member of the population would regularly report their own deviations from approved behavior. The priest, as the representative of divine authority, had the power to grant or withhold absolution. This created a dependency relationship. You needed the priest to relieve the guilt that the system itself had created. The priest became the gatekeeper of your own peace of mind. Fast forward to the 21st century. You open an app and scroll through a feed of curated moments from other people's lives. Each image has been selected, filtered, and presented to maximize its appearance of happiness, success, and desirability. You compare your interior experience, which includes boredom, anxiety, and uncertainty, with their exterior presentation. The gap between the two generates inadequacy. You respond by curating your own presentation. You select an image, apply a filter, write a caption that implies ease and confidence you may not feel and post it. Then you wait. The waiting is crucial. The likes and comments become the contemporary version of priestly absolution. They tell you that you are acceptable, temporarily. But the relief lasts only until the next gap opens between your experience and someone else's presentation. Then the cycle begins again. Inadequacy, performance, temporary validation, renewed inadequacy. The system is structurally identical to the medieval confessional, but with one key evolution: it operates continuously. You're not required to confess once per year. You confess multiple times per day. And you do it voluntarily, eagerly even. The Gnostic text on the origin of the world describes the archons as beings who feed on human emotional energy, particularly the energy generated by anxiety, shame, and unfulfilled desire. Whether this is meant literally or metaphorically is less important than the systemic observation. Control systems stabilize themselves by generating and harvesting specific emotional states. Guilt is one of the most potent. Guilt keeps you off balance. It prevents you from resting in your own authority. It ensures that you are always seeking external validation, external absolution, external permission to exist. In traditional religious structures, guilt was generated through the concept of sin, actions or thoughts that violated divine law. In contemporary secular structures, guilt is generated through the concept of inadequacy, the failure to achieve the standards of success, beauty, productivity, or lifestyle presented as normal. The content has changed. The mechanism has not. You're not thin enough. You're not successful enough. You're not interesting enough. You are not happy enough. And the evidence is everywhere because everyone else appears to be all of these things. The fact that their appearance is a performance identical to your own performance does not reduce its power. The inadequacy feels real because the comparison is real. So you work harder, You optimize. You track your steps, your calories, your sleep, your productivity. You turn yourself into a data stream and then judge the data. You become both the prisoner and the guard, both the confessor and the priest. The Gnostics called this the counterfeit spirit, a false sense of self generated by the system to keep you locked into the system's values. It is not your voice, but you experience it as your voice. It tells you that you are not enough, and it sounds like concern. It tells you to be afraid, and it sounds like wisdom. It tells you to conform, and it sounds like common sense. This is the ultimate achievement of a control system, to make control feel like choice, to make surveillance feel like self-improvement, to make the cage feel like a home you built yourself. The transition from external enforcement to internal enforcement represents a massive reduction in the cost of control. A dictator who must threaten every citizen constantly is expensive and unstable. A system where citizens threaten themselves is cheap and robust. 20th century political philosophy called this soft power, or hegemony, the ability to control not through force, but through the manufacturing of consent. You agree to the terms not because you were compelled, but because you were convinced that the terms represent your own best interest. But what if your sense of your own best interest has been shaped entirely by the system you're trying to evaluate? What if the voice you think of as you is actually an installation, a program running on your hardware but written by someone else? The Gnostic answer is that this is precisely the situation. The you that wants the promotion, the relationship, the approval, the achievement, that you is not the deepest you. It is the you that has been formatted to be compatible with the prison. It is the version of you that can be managed. And the deepest horror is this: that formatted self is not imposed by force. It is cultivated through desire. The prison does not run on punishment. It runs on wanting. Desire is not the problem. Desire is the fuel. The Gnostic critique is not that humans should eliminate all wanting, a position that leads to its own pathology, but that desire has been weaponized, organized into chains that lead nowhere but back to the beginning. In the Gospel of Thomas, one of the most enigmatic Gnostic texts, Jesus says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not have will destroy you." This is not moral instruction. This is diagnostic description. Unexpressed internal reality turns inward and becomes pathology. Expressed internal reality becomes liberation. But the system cannot afford liberation, so it must ensure that desire is continuously directed outward, toward objects, experiences, and achievements that can be controlled, marketed, and sold. Consider the architecture of modern desire. You're hungry so you eat, but you are not just hungry for calories, you're hungry for an experience that has been pre-sold to you through imagery, branding, and cultural association. The burger is not merely food, it is convenience, it is Americana, it is rebellion against health culture or participation in it depending on which burger you choose. You're not satisfying hunger, you're performing an identity, and the performance requires props. The props cost money, the money requires labor, the labor requires time, the time is your life. The Gnostic texts describe the archons as beings who cannot create, only imitate. They cannot generate life, only redirect it. They take the intrinsic human capacity for desire, which, in its pure form, is the desire for reunion with the divine source, and reroute it toward objects within the material system. You desire transcendence, so they sell you a vacation. You desire meaning, so they sell you a career. You desire connection, so they sell you a platform. You desire peace, so they sell you a product. The desire is real. The object is counterfeit. And this is where the trap achieves its full sophistication. Because the object does provide temporary relief. The vacation does feel like transcendence for 3 days. The career does feel like meaning for the first year. The platform does feel like connection for the first 100 interactions. The product does produce peace for the first week. The relief is real enough to validate the system, but it is temporary enough to require repetition. You're not tricked into wanting something that provides nothing. You are tricked into wanting something that provides just enough to keep you coming back, but never enough to set you free. Neuroscience has mapped this mechanism with extraordinary precision. Dopamine is not the chemical of pleasure. It is the chemical of anticipation. It spikes not when you receive the reward, but when you expect to receive the reward. This is why the most addictive experiences are not those that provide guaranteed satisfaction, but those that provide variable satisfaction. A slot machine that paid out every time would be boring. A slot machine that never paid out would be abandoned. A slot machine that pays out unpredictably generates compulsive behavior. The gambler is not chasing the money. The gambler is chasing the spike. Your phone does not buzz every time you check it, but it might. That possibility is enough. The dating app does not produce a match every swipe, but it might. The social media post does not always generate likes, but it might. The variability is not a flaw, it is the core design. In Gnostic terminology, this is called the passion of the flesh, not in the puritanical sense of sexual repression, but in the technical sense of passive submission to appetites that have been externally programmed. You think you are choosing what you want, but your wanting has been shaped by a system that needs you to want in very specific directions. Sex is the most obvious example, but far from the only one. The Gnostic texts spend considerable time on sexuality not because they are prudish. Many Gnostic sects were remarkably sexually liberated for their time, but because sexuality is the clearest demonstration of how biological drives can be captured and redirected by systemic forces. You are attracted to certain physical features not purely because of genetic compatibility, but because culture has trained you to perceive those features as desirable. The training begins in childhood and continues throughout life through thousands of images, stories, and social cues. By the time you experience attraction as an adult, you cannot separate the biological component from the programmed component. This does not mean attraction is fake. It means attraction is hybrid. Part of it is genuinely you, part of it is installation. The Gnostics describe sexual reproduction as the primary mechanism by which the material system perpetuates itself. Not because sex is evil, but because biological reproduction ensures that new participants continuously enter the game. Every birth is a new consciousness trapped in matter, subject to the same hungers, the same fears, the same cycle. Modern evolutionary psychology would not disagree with this description, though it would frame it differently. Genes that successfully reproduce are genes that create organisms driven to reproduce. The drive is not chosen, it is inherited, and it shapes everything: mate selection, status competition, resource accumulation, tribal affiliation. You think you want the car because it is beautiful, but the car is a status signal. The status signal is a mating advantage. The mating advantage is a reproductive strategy. The reproductive strategy is genetic imperative. At no point in this chain did you make a free choice. You inherited a drive, and the culture provided a target. The Gnostic position is that awareness of this mechanism does not eliminate the drive, but it does create distance from it. You can feel attraction without being owned by it. You can experience hunger without being defined by it. You can notice the wanting without immediately moving to satisfy it. This distance is the beginning of freedom, but the system cannot afford for you to have distance. So it works continuously to collapse the gap between stimulus and response. It trains you to identify so completely with your desires that the question, "Is this one actually mine?" never arises. The advertisements do not say, "Buy this product because we need your money." They say, "You deserve this." They train you to believe that satisfying every impulse is an act of self-care rather than an act of submission. And the training works. You feel guilty for not buying the thing. You feel deprived for not having the experience. You feel like you are failing yourself by not pursuing the achievement. The system has successfully convinced you that resistance to its priorities is resistance to your own well-being. This is the final lock on the cage. You're not held in place by force, you are held in place by the belief that leaving would be self-harm. Abundance does not end wanting, it relocates it. The person who finally achieves financial security discovers they now want significance. The person who achieves significance discovers they want legacy. The person who achieves legacy discovers they want immortality. And immortality is the one thing the material system absolutely cannot provide, so the wanting never resolves. It simply escalates. The Gnostics observed this pattern and called it the wheel of becoming, a cycle of birth, desire, suffering, death, and rebirth into the same cycle. Not because of moral failure, but because of structural design. The system is built to be unsatisfiable. In the Pistis Sophia, a later Gnostic text, the protagonist asks why human suffering continues even for those who have done nothing wrong. The answer provided is not theological but mechanical. Suffering is intrinsic to attachment, not attachment in the sense of love, but attachment in the sense of identification. When you identify with something, a body, a relationship, a role, a possession, you've created a vulnerability. When the thing changes or ends, you suffer, and everything in the material world changes or ends, suffering is guaranteed. This is not pessimism, this is physics. Love becomes fear of loss. You meet someone who makes you happy, and immediately a new form of anxiety enters your life. The anxiety that they will leave, that they will die, that they will change, that you will change. The happiness is real, but it is now permanently bonded to a vulnerability that did not exist before. Status becomes fear of insignificance. You achieve recognition in your field, and immediately you must defend that recognition against younger competitors, changing trends, and the inevitable decline of your own capacities. The achievement is real, but it is now a position that must be maintained, which means it is now a source of stress. Pleasure becomes fear of emptiness. You find an activity or substance that reliably produces good feelings, and immediately you are confronted with the question of what happens when the activity ends or the substance wears off. The pleasure is real, but it is temporary, which means it is now a contrast point that makes ordinary experience feel deficient. The pattern is universal. Every gain creates a new form of potential loss. Every satisfaction creates a new baseline of expectation. Every achievement creates a new standard against which future performance will be measured. This is why the affluent are not proportionally happier than the middle class, and the middle class are not proportionally happier than the poor. Beyond the level of basic security, additional resources do not produce additional happiness, because happiness is not a function of absolute wealth, but of the delta between expectation and reality. The expectation rises with the resources. The gap remains. Psychological research calls this the hedonic treadmill, or hedonic adaptation. No matter what level you achieve, you adapt to it within months, and it becomes the new normal. The new normal is no longer satisfying, so you pursue the next level, and the cycle continues. The Gnostics would say, this is not a flaw in your psychology. This is the psychology functioning exactly as designed. The system needs you to be perpetually dissatisfied, because a satisfied being would stop participating. A satisfied being would stop working to acquire more. A satisfied being would stop competing for status. A satisfied being would stop consuming to fill voids. A satisfied being would exit the game. So satisfaction must remain forever out of reach. Not so far that you give up, but just far enough that you keep running. Consider the modern epidemic of burnout. People working 60, 70, 80 hours per week in pursuit of goals that, even when achieved, do not produce lasting fulfillment. The external observer sees this and thinks, They should just work less. But the person inside the system cannot see that option because their entire identity has become fused with achievement. Who are you if you are not productive? Who are you if you are not successful? Who are you if you are not moving forward? These questions are terrifying because they reveal that your sense of self has become completely dependent on external metrics. The Gnostic term for this is the false self, or the ego formed by the archons. It is the identity you construct in response to the demands of the material system. It is not entirely false, it is a real structure, a real pattern of thought and behaviour. But it is false in the sense that it is not your deepest nature. It is a costume you have been wearing so long you have forgotten it is a costume. And removing the costume feels like self-annihilation. This is why people resist awakening even when they are suffering. The suffering is at least familiar. The self that is suffering is at least coherent. To question that self is to enter a kind of ego death, a dissolving of the boundaries that have kept you feeling solid and definite. The alternative, to continue suffering within the familiar structure, becomes preferable to the uncertainty of transformation. You choose the known prison over the unknown freedom. The Gnostics saw this choice being made over and over throughout history. They saw people who glimpsed the bars, who felt the weight of the chains, who sensed that something was deeply wrong with the structure of reality itself, and then turned away, chose comfort, chose distraction, chose to re-enter the sleep. But a few did not turn away. A few held the gaze long enough to see what lay on the other side of the conventional world. And what they saw was so disruptive to the established order that it had to be named, categorized, and contained. They saw Sophia fall. In the Gnostic cosmology, before matter, before time, before the demiurge, there was the pleroma, the fullness, the realm of pure divine being. Within the pleroma existed a series of emanations or aeons, each representing an aspect of divine consciousness. These were not separate gods, but facets of a unified whole existing in perfect harmony. Sophia, whose name means wisdom, was one of these eons. She was not lesser. She was not flawed in her essential nature, but she did something that the other eons did not do. She acted alone. The texts differ slightly in their details, but the core narrative is consistent. Sophia desired to know the ultimate source, the Father, the infinite depth from which all emanation flowed. But she desired this knowledge without her consort, without the balancing partner that all the other aeons maintained. She reached upward in isolation. This was not disobedience in the moral sense. It was asymmetry in the structural sense. It was an action taken outside the balanced flow of divine relationship. And because the pleroma operates on the principles of harmony and symmetry, the asymmetrical action produced an asymmetrical result. Sophia's solitary reaching created a kind of rupture. The desire, separated from its balancing force, became distorted. It produced not knowledge but a shadow, not light but a reflection. This shadow, this distorted reflection of divine will, became aware of itself. It looked around and saw nothing greater than itself. This entity, called Yaldabaoth, Saklas, Samael, simply the demiurge, was born from error, not from evil intention, but from imbalance, from loneliness. And this is the inversion that makes the Gnostic narrative so psychologically rich. Sophia does not fall because she is wicked. She falls because she is lonely, because she wants to know, because she reaches for something beyond the prescribed boundary. In other words, she falls for the same reasons humans fall: curiosity, longing, the desire for direct experience rather than mediated knowledge. The texts describe her reaction to the birth of the demiurge as horror. She sees what her isolated desire has produced, a being that is ignorant, arrogant, and hungry for control, and she attempts to hide it, to contain it, to prevent it from causing harm. But it is too late. The Demiurge has already begun to create. Using the stolen divine power that it inherited from Sophia's disrupted emanation, the Demiurge fashions the material cosmos, not from nothing but from shadow, not with wisdom but with ambition. It creates a realm where it can be supreme, where it can enforce its will, where it can receive worship, and then it populates that realm with beings, humans, who are made in its image, but who carry within them a spark of the true divine, inherited from Sophia herself. This is the Gnostic explanation for why humans feel both material and spiritual, both trapped and transcendent, both animal and aware. You are a hybrid being. Part of you was made by the Demiurge from earthly matter. Part of you is a fragment of Sophia's original light, trapped in the Demiurge's creation. You are both prisoner and divine hostage. The psychological parallel is immediate. Every human carries a sense of not fully belonging to the world, a sense that something is wrong, that something has been lost, that something essential remains just out of reach. The Gnostic narrative says, this feeling is not neurosis, this feeling is memory. You remember, however dimly, that you came from somewhere else, that you are something other than what the world tells you that you are, that you contain a capacity the system does not acknowledge and cannot contain, but that memory has been suppressed, deliberately, because if you remembered fully, you would leave, and the system cannot afford mass exodus. So the memory is fragmented, distorted, and buried under layer after layer of material concern. You get brief flashes, moments of beauty, moments of connection, moments where the veil seems thin and you sense something vast and loving just beyond the surface of things. But then the moment passes. The bills need to be paid, the emails need to be answered. The world reasserts itself, and you forget again. Sophia's fall, then, is not just a mythological event. It is a structural description of how consciousness becomes trapped in matter, how divinity becomes obscured, how the infinite becomes convinced it is finite. The guilt you feel, the inadequacy you carry, the sense that you are somehow broken. These are not evidence of moral failure. They are inherited from the original rupture. You're born into a fractured cosmos, and the fracture is internal to you. This is unbearably sad. But it's also strangely liberating. Because if the brokenness is not your fault, then the repair is not your responsibility. You're not being asked to fix yourself. You are being asked to remember yourself. And yet the system built by the Demiurge has a powerful interest in preventing that remembering. It has constructed an entire architecture of distraction, obligation, and fear to keep you locked into material identity. The first line of defense is biological. Your body has needs, hunger, thirst, pain, avoidance, reproductive drive. These needs are real and non-negotiable. They keep you focused on physical survival, which keeps you focused on the material plane. The second line of defense is social. Your need for belonging, for status, for recognition. These are also real, hardwired into your neurobiology by millions of years of evolution. To be exiled from the group was to die. So you are intensely motivated to conform, to perform, to be acceptable. The third line of defense is existential. The terror of death, the fear of meaninglessness, the dread of dissolution. These fears are so powerful that most people will accept almost any belief system that offers relief from them. And the final line of defense is the most elegant: desire itself. You want things. You want them intensely. And the pursuit of those things fills your time and attention so completely that you never pause long enough to ask whether the wanting is truly yours. Layer after layer of distraction, need, fear, and desire, all working together to keep you locked into identification with the material self. But the divine spark remains, buried, suppressed, forgotten, but not destroyed. The Gnostics believed it could not be destroyed because it was not created by the Demiurge. It was only captured by the demiurge, and what is captured can be freed. But freedom requires something the system works very hard to prevent: stillness, attention, the willingness to stop running and look directly at the structure of the cage. And when you do stop, when you do look, the first thing you encounter is not liberation, it is death. You're born without consent into a body you did not design, in a time you did not choose, into a family you did not select, within a cultural system you did not create. Before you have language, you are already being shaped. Before you have agency, you're already being programmed. The milk is food, but it is also love. The touch is comfort, but it is also approval. The voice is sound, but it is also authority. Every need you have is met by an external source, and so you learn. You are not self-sufficient. You are dependent, and the terms of that dependency are set by others. By the time you develop the cognitive capacity to question this arrangement, the arrangement has already become you. Your sense of identity, your understanding of value, your map of reality. All of it constructed using materials and blueprints you did not choose. This is what the Gnostics meant by the inherited fracture. You're not broken because of something you did. You're born into brokenness. The system is broken. The cosmos itself is built on a mistake. And you, as a participant in that cosmos, carry the mistake in your very structure. The biological body is a miracle of engineering. Billions of cells cooperating with extraordinary precision to maintain homeostasis, to repair damage, to grow, and adapt. But it is also a trap, because the body has an agenda that is not necessarily aligned with your deepest well-being. The body wants to survive, it wants to reproduce, it wants to avoid pain and seek pleasure. These drives are incredibly powerful, and they are pre-rational. They do not care about your spiritual development. They care about genetic continuation. So you are a consciousness piloting a vehicle that has its own priorities. And those priorities are often in direct conflict with the kind of awakening the Gnostic texts describe. The body needs food, so you spend enormous amounts of time acquiring, preparing, and consuming food. The body needs rest, so you spend a third of your life unconscious. The body needs physical safety, so you spend your waking hours working to secure shelter and resources. The body ages, so you spend increasing energy managing decline and decay. None of this is optional. You cannot simply decide to stop eating or stop sleeping or stop aging. The material constraints are absolute. You are awareness trapped in biology, and biology has non-negotiable demands. The Gnostic critique is not that you should reject the body, though some Gnostic sects did veer into extreme asceticism, but that you should recognize the body as a temporary vehicle rather than your essential self. The problem is that recognition requires distance, and the body is very good at eliminating distance. When you are hungry, hunger becomes your entire world. When you are in pain, pain becomes your entire identity. When you are aroused, desire becomes your only priority. The body collapses awareness into immediate sensation over and over thousands of times per day. This is not a design flaw, this is survival optimization. An organism that could easily detach from bodily signals would not survive long enough to reproduce. So evolution has built a system where bodily needs dominate consciousness. But that same system makes liberation almost impossible. Because liberation requires stepping outside the immediacy of sensation and seeing it as sensation rather than as reality itself. In the Gospel of Philip, another Gnostic text, there is a passage: "Those who say they will die first and then rise are in error. If they do not first receive the resurrection while they live, when they die they will receive nothing. This is not about literal resurrection of the flesh. This is about awakening while still embodied. Because if you wait until death to wake up, it will be too late. Death, in the Gnostic framework, is not an exit. It is a reset. The standard religious framework presents death as a transition. You die, your soul is judged, and based on that judgment you go to heaven, hell, or some intermediate state. The story ends. The soul finds its final destination. The Gnostic framework presents death as a trap. In multiple Gnostic texts, most clearly in the Pistis Sophia and the Books of Joux, there is a description of what happens to consciousness at the moment of death. The soul, now separated from the body, begins to ascend through various levels or spheres of reality. At each level, it encounters archons, the rulers of that sphere. These archons are not interested in torturing the soul, they are interested in recycling it. The soul is interrogated. It is shown its failures, its attachments, its unresolved karma. It is convinced that it is not yet pure enough to transcend. It is told that it must return to the material world to learn the lessons it failed to learn in its previous incarnation. And then, and this is crucial, it is made to drink from the cup of forgetfulness. This is not metaphor. The texts are quite specific. There is a mechanism, whether literal or symbolic, by which memory is erased. The soul forgets its divine origin. It forgets its previous lives. It forgets the knowledge it may have gained. It is returned to matter as a blank slate, ready to begin the cycle again. Reincarnation as described here is not an opportunity for growth. It is a prison sentence with no end date. The purpose of the memory wipe is obvious. If you remembered your previous attempts to escape, you would not be fooled by the same traps. If you remembered dying, you would not fear death. If you remembered the archons, you would not obey them. So memory must be erased in order for the system to remain stable. This framework maps eerily well onto contemporary reports of near-death experiences. Thousands of people from diverse cultural and religious backgrounds report similar phenomena, leaving the body, moving through a tunnel, encountering a bright light, feeling overwhelming love, meeting deceased relatives or religious figures, and then either choosing or being told to return to life. The standard interpretation is that this experience is a preview of heaven, a reassurance that death is not the end, that love awaits on the other side. The Gnostic interpretation is darker. This is the first layer of the deception. The light is a lure. The love is real, but it is bait. The beings you meet are not your actual relatives, but archontic simulations designed to be emotionally persuasive. And the choice to return or move forward is not a choice at all. It is a predetermined script meant to make you believe you have agency. Is this true? There is no way to know without dying and retaining full memory through the process, which is precisely what the system is designed to prevent. But the structural logic is sound. If you were running a prison and you needed to keep the inmates from escaping, you would not allow them to retain a memory of their previous escape attempts. You would reset them, and you would make the reset feel like a natural transition rather than a violent erasure. The light at the end of the tunnel reported in near-death experiences may be exactly what the Gnostic texts warn about: a beautiful trap, a simulation of divine love designed to keep you moving through the cycle. And the beings who operate this system are not doing it out of cruelty. They are doing it because they believe it is necessary. The archons in many Gnostic texts are described as genuinely convinced that they are maintaining cosmic order. They are the ultimate middle managers, enforcing rules they did not write and do not fully understand, convinced that the system must be preserved at all costs. The soul that tries to bypass the archons and ascend directly to the pleroma is seen as a rule breaker, a disruptor, a threat to cosmic stability. It must be stopped, not tortured but redirected, gently if possible, forcefully if necessary. Some Gnostic texts provide explicit instructions for how to bypass the archons. Passwords, sacred names, specific utterances or visualizations that confuse or disarm the gatekeepers long enough for the soul to slip past. Whether these are meant literally or as psychological techniques is ambiguous. What is not ambiguous is the underlying message. The default path, leads back to incarnation. Escape requires knowledge, preparation, and the will to resist the very appealing offer to return home. Because that home is not your origin, it is your cage. And the most horrifying possibility is that you have already lived this life thousands of times, that you have already encountered these exact circumstances, made these exact mistakes, felt this exact suffering, and that each time at the moment of death, your memory was wiped and you were sent back to do it all again. The only variable is whether this time you wake up before you die. This is why the Gnostics place such emphasis on gnosis, direct knowledge during life. Not belief, not faith, not doctrine, but experiential recognition of your true nature while you are still embodied. Because if you wait until death to figure it out, the game is already over. In the early centuries of the Common Era, small communities scattered throughout the Mediterranean, North Africa, India, and the Near East began practicing something dangerous. They gathered in secret. They shared texts that were not approved by any central authority. They claimed direct access to divine knowledge without the mediation of priests, temples, or sacrifices. They called themselves the Gnostics, the ones who know. They were not a unified movement. There was no Gnostic pope, no central doctrine, no orthodoxy to enforce conformity. Different groups had different practices, different texts, different cosmologies, but they shared a core conviction. The material world is a trap. Institutional religion is complicit in that trap, and liberation requires personal awakening rather than collective ritual. This was intolerable to every existing power structure. For the Roman Empire, the problem was civic. Roman religion was not about personal belief. It was about public performance of loyalty. You burned incense to the emperor not because you believed he was divine, but because burning incense was how you demonstrated that you were not a threat to the state. It was a political act dressed as a religious one. The Gnostics refused, not because they wanted to overthrow the empire, but because they did not recognize the empire's authority over interior reality. You can command my actions, they said, but you cannot command my knowing. This distinction between outer compliance and inner freedom was seen as sedition. If everyone adopted this position, the entire system of social control would collapse. So the Gnostics were persecuted not for what they believed, but for where they located authority, inside rather than outside. For the emerging Christian orthodoxy, the problem was even more fundamental. Early Christianity was in the process of consolidating power, establishing hierarchy, and determining which texts and teachings would be considered authoritative. The Gnostic claim that every individual could access divine truth directly threatened the entire priesthood model. If you do not need a priest to intercede with God, you do not need a church. If you do not need a church, you do not need tithes, cathedrals, bishops, or Rome. The whole institutional structure becomes unnecessary. So Gnostic teachings had to be eliminated, not debated, not absorbed, eliminated. The early church fathers, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Epiphanius, wrote extensively against Gnosticism. They called it heresy, which originally just meant choice, the crime of choosing your own interpretation rather than accepting the authorized one. They said Gnostic teachings were dangerous, confusing, and inspired by demons. But if you read those refutations carefully, what emerges is not that Gnostic ideas were stupid, but that they were threatening. They threatened the monopoly on salvation. They threatened the revenue stream. They threatened the power structure. Irenaeus, writing around 180 CE, complained that Gnostics were like people who took a beautiful mosaic of a king and rearranged the pieces to form a fox. He meant this as an insult, but he accidentally revealed the method. Gnostics were using the same source materials as Orthodox Christians, the same Jewish scriptures, the same stories of Jesus, but arranging them into a completely different picture. And the picture they created was one where institutional authority was not necessary, where each person was responsible for their own liberation, where the hierarchy of heaven was inverted and the God of the Old Testament was not the ultimate divine source, but a lesser, ignorant being. This could not be allowed. By the 4th century, after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine, the persecution intensified. Gnostic texts were systematically destroyed. Communities were disbanded. Teachers were exiled or killed. Within a few generations, Gnosticism as a living tradition was functionally extinct. But the ideas did not die. They went underground. Throughout the medieval period, echoes of Gnostic thought emerged in various heretical movements. The Cathars in France, the Bogomils in the Balkans, the Paulicians in Armenia. Each independently developed cosmologies that resembled Gnostic frameworks. The material world as a prison, the God of this world as false, salvation through knowledge rather than faith. And each was violently suppressed. The Albigensian crusade against the Cathars in the 13th century was one of the bloodiest campaigns in medieval history. Entire towns were massacred. The phrase, "kill them all, God will recognize his own," was reportedly uttered by a papal legate when asked how to distinguish heretics from faithful Catholics during the siege of Béziers. 20,000 people died in that city alone. This is what happens when a system feels existentially threatened. It does not argue. It does not persuade. It eliminates. Because the Gnostic claim that you do not need the system to access the divine is not just a theological disagreement. It is an existential threat to every structure that derives power from being the gatekeeper between humans and God. If the gate is an illusion, the gatekeeper has no function. But some gatekeepers did not wait for institutional violence. They imposed it on themselves. In December of 1945, 2 brothers digging for fertilizer near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi unearthed a sealed jar. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 texts. These were not random documents. They were a library, a deliberately assembled collection of Gnostic scriptures hidden sometime in the late 4th century and preserved by the dry desert climate for over 500 years. Someone facing the imminent destruction of their tradition had buried their most sacred texts in the hope that future generations might find them. They were right. The Nag Hammadi library contained some of the most important religious and philosophical texts of the ancient world. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, the Hypostasis of the Archons, the Thunder, Perfect Mind, texts that had been completely lost to history, known only through the hostile quotations of their opponents. And what those texts reveal is not what the Church Fathers claimed. The Gnostics were not sexual perverts engaging in bizarre rituals. They were not nihilists who hated creation. They were sophisticated thinkers grappling with the deepest questions of existence. Why is there suffering? Why is there ignorance? Why does the world feel like a trap? Their answers were different from orthodox answers, but they were not crazy. They were rigorous, internally consistent, and disturbingly relevant to contemporary experience. So why were they suppressed so thoroughly? The surface answer is theological. They contradicted official doctrine. But the deeper answer is structural. They undermined the entire system of mediated salvation. Consider the Orthodox Christian model. You're born in sin. You cannot save yourself. You need Jesus, but you cannot access Jesus directly. You need the church. The church administers the sacraments. The sacraments provide grace. Grace makes you eligible for salvation. Salvation happens after death, and only if you have been obedient to church authority throughout life. Every single step in that chain requires the church. Remove the church and the whole thing collapses. Now consider the Gnostic model. You're born with a divine spark already inside you. You do not need to be saved by an external entity. You need to remember what you already are. that remembering can happen directly, through inner experience without any institutional mediation. No priests required, no tithes required, no buildings required, no hierarchy required. This is why Gnosticism was labelled heresy. Not because it was false, truth and falsehood were never the real criteria, but because it was decentralizing. It returned power to the individual. And power, once returned, is very difficult to reclaim. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE was the moment when Christian orthodoxy became official imperial policy. The council was convened by Emperor Constantine, not by theologians. Its purpose was to settle disputes that were causing political instability. Unity of doctrine meant unity of empire. The Nicene Creed, which emerged from that council, established the boundaries of acceptable belief. Anything outside those boundaries was heresy. And heresy was not just a religious crime, it was a political crime. It was treason against the cosmic order that the empire claimed to represent. The Gnostic texts were ordered destroyed. Possessing them became illegal. Teaching them became punishable by exile or death. And it worked. For over 1,500 years, Gnosticism existed only as a slur, a category of wrongness, a name for the people who got it all backwards. Until the jar was opened in 945. What the Nag Hammadi texts reveal is that the suppression was not about protecting people from dangerous ideas, it was about protecting institutions from dangerous questions. Questions like, what if the God of the Old Testament is not the ultimate God? What if suffering is not punishment but structure? What if salvation is not something you earn but something you remember? What if the church is not the solution but part of the problem? These questions do not have safe answers. They unravel the entire framework, and that is precisely why they had to be eliminated. But ideas, once thought, cannot be unthought. They can be suppressed, but suppression only drives them deeper. And when they re-emerge, they carry the weight of everything that tried to destroy them. The Gnostic texts were written in a time of empire, slavery, religious persecution, and existential uncertainty. They were written by people who had seen the mechanisms of power up close and recognized them as archontic, who had seen institutional religion and recognized it as a control system, who had looked at the world and asked, is this really the best a loving God could do? Their answer was no. This is not the work of the ultimate God. This is the work of a derivative power that has mistaken itself for the ultimate, and we are trapped in its delusion. But we do not have to stay trapped. We can wake up. We can see through the illusion. We can exit the system. And the fact that these texts were buried for 1,600 years and then rediscovered at the exact moment when humanity was developing the technological capacity to destroy itself is not perhaps an accident. Perhaps someone knew we would need them. Every institution that claims to stand between you and the divine operates on the same model. You are insufficient. We are necessary. You cannot read the texts yourself. They are too complex, too sacred, too dangerous. You need priests to interpret them for you. You cannot pray directly. Your prayers are unworthy. You need saints to intercede on your behalf. You cannot be forgiven directly, and your sin is too great. You need sacraments administered by authorized personnel. You cannot know God directly. You are too corrupted. You need the church to mediate the relationship. At every point, a human institution inserts itself between you and the transcendent. And at every point, that insertion comes with a cost. Tithes, obedience, silence, submission. This is not unique to Christianity. It is the structure of every religious hierarchy. The Brahmins in Hinduism, the rabbinical authorities in Judaism, the ulama in Islam, the lamas in Tibetan Buddhism. Each tradition develops a class of specialists who claim exclusive access to the sacred and then rent that access back to the lay people. The Gnostic critique is that this entire model is archontic. It is the demiurge's system scaled down to institutional size. Obey the authorities, perform the rituals, pay the fees, and maybe, if you're very good, you will be rewarded later, after you die, if the gatekeepers approve. Heaven becomes a carrot that is always one more sacrament away. Hell becomes a stick that keeps you compliant. And the priesthood becomes the indispensable intermediary, the one group that can tip the scales in your favour. This is a brilliant system, because it is unfalsifiable. If you die and there is no heaven, you will not be around to complain. If you die and there is a heaven, the church gets to claim credit. And if you express doubt while alive, you are told that doubt itself is a sin that jeopardizes your salvation. The trap is perfect. You cannot test the claim without dying. And by the time you die, you cannot report back. So the institution maintains a monopoly on the unknowable. And monopolies on the unknowable are the most profitable monopolies of all, because the customer can never comparison shop. The medieval Catholic Church became obscenely wealthy through this model. Indulgences, literally paying money to reduce your time in purgatory, were sold on an industrial scale. The construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome was funded largely through indulgence sales. You could buy your way out of punishment. Or more precisely, you could buy the church's promise that God would reduce your punishment. The corruption became so blatant that it triggered the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther's famous 95 Theses were not primarily about theology. They were about the monetization of salvation. He was not rejecting Christianity, he was rejecting the business model. But the Protestant solution, eliminating the priesthood and giving individuals direct access to Scripture, did not eliminate the core problem. It just relocated it. Now the mediation happened through the text itself. The Bible became the new gatekeeper, and interpreting the Bible became the new source of authority. Protestantism fragmented into thousands of denominations, each claiming to have the correct interpretation, each insisting that their reading was the one true path. The monopoly was broken, but the underlying structure, external authority determining your worthiness, remained intact. The Gnostic position is more radical. The problem is not which institution you trust. The problem is trusting any institution to tell you who you are, because institutions, by their nature, cannot afford for you to be self-sufficient. A self-sufficient population does not need management, it does not generate revenue, it does not provide a base of power for the managers, so institutions must cultivate dependency. They must convince you that you are broken in ways that only they can fix, that you are ignorant in ways that only they can educate, that you are sinful in ways that only they can absolve, and they must do this while appearing benevolent, while appearing to care about your well-being, while appearing to have your best interests at heart. This is the demiurge's method at the institutional level. Control through care, domination through love, imprisonment through salvation. The priest who tells you that you need the church is not lying exactly. He believes it. He has been trained to believe it. His entire identity is built on the premise that the church is necessary. To question that premise is to question his own purpose. So he is both prisoner and guard. He enforces the system because the system is the only reality he knows. And he does it with genuine conviction, which makes him far more effective than any cynical manipulator could be. This is how control systems achieve stability. They do not require everyone to be in on the conspiracy. They only require everyone to internalize the logic of the system and then enforce that logic on others. You do not need a vast coordinated effort to keep people trapped. You only need to make sure that the people who escape are seen as crazy, dangerous, or lost, and then the herd polices itself. The Gnostics saw this pattern and opted out. They said, "We do not need your priests. We do not need your sacraments. We do not need your permission to know God." And for that, they were destroyed. But the impulse did not die. It could not die. Because it is not a belief system. It is a recognition. And once you recognize that the cage is a cage, you cannot unsee it. You can only choose what to do with the knowledge. History is written by the victors, but it is lived by the exiles. Throughout every era of orthodoxy, there have been individuals who could not accept the authorized narrative, not because they were rebellious by nature, but because the narrative did not match their direct experience. They prayed and felt nothing. They performed the rituals and found them empty. They read the scriptures and saw contradictions. They looked at the hierarchy and recognized it as human construction, not divine mandate. And so they left. Not always physically, but internally. They withdrew their belief. They stopped performing the charade. Some did this quietly, maintaining the outward appearance of conformity while cultivating an inner life that had nothing to do with the official doctrine. These are the ones we will never know about because they left no record. They survived by remaining invisible. Others could not remain silent. They spoke, they wrote, they taught, and they were punished. Meister Eckhart, a 14th century Christian mystic, preached that the divine spark within each person was identical to God. Not similar, identical. He said that when you strip away all the layers of constructed identity, what remains is pure divinity. The church condemned him for heresy. His works were suppressed. He died before he could be formally tried. Giordano Bruno, a 16th century philosopher, proposed an infinite universe with no privilege centre, where every star was a sun with its own worlds. He suggested that divinity was not located in a distant heaven, but immanent in all things. The Inquisition burned him at the stake in 1600. Baruch Spinoza, a 17th century Jewish philosopher, argued that God and nature were one, that the universe itself was the divine substance, and that traditional religious authority was a form of tyranny over the mind. He was excommunicated from the Jewish community and lived the rest of his life in isolation. Each of these figures arrived independently at conclusions that echoed Gnostic insights, that institutional religion is a cage, that authority is a fiction, that divinity is not external but internal, and each paid the price for saying so publicly. But the more important story is not the famous heretics. It is the countless unnamed individuals who had the same realization and simply walked away, who stopped going to church, who stopped praying to the authorized God, who stopped believing that suffering was somehow part of a divine plan. These people are invisible to history because they did not write manifestos. They just quietly withdrew their participation. They lived their lives as best they could within the constraints of the material system, but they did not give the system their inner allegiance. This is the most dangerous form of resistance because it is unassailable. You cannot argue someone out of their direct experience. You cannot punish someone for private disbelief. You can exile them, burn them, imprison them, but you cannot make them believe. The Gnostic realization is that the system only has power over you to the extent that you grant it legitimacy. The moment you withdraw that legitimacy, the system becomes irrelevant. Not defeated, just irrelevant. You still have to navigate it. You still have to pay taxes, follow laws, perform the minimum required behaviors to avoid sanction, but you are no longer identified with it. You're playing a role, wearing a mask, moving through a game whose rules you recognize as arbitrary. This is what the Gnostics called being in the world, but not of it. You participate in the material system because you have a body and the body has needs, but you do not confuse the system with reality. You do not mistake the game for truth. This creates a kind of loneliness, because you can no longer bond with others over shared illusions. You cannot participate in collective fantasies about the meaning and purpose of the game. You see through it, and seeing through it isolates you from everyone who still believes. You sit in meetings and hear people speak with utter seriousness about quarterly earnings, market share, competitive positioning, and you think none of this matters. We are all going to die, the company will dissolve, the market will crash, the entire economic System is a collective hallucination. But you cannot say this, because saying it marks you as insane, so you nod, you participate, you play your role, and inside you are utterly alone. This is the cost of gnosis, not the dramatic cost of martyrdom, but the quiet cost of alienation. You lose the comfort of shared meaning. You lose the consolation of believing that your suffering serves a purpose. You lose the hope that someone is watching, someone cares, someone will make it all okay in the end. What you gain is clarity, but clarity is cold comfort when everyone around you is warm in their delusions. The world becomes thin, not physically, the objects remain solid, the people remain present, but existentially. The weight of meaning that once made everything feel important begins to lift, and beneath it is not emptiness but transparency. You see your co-workers compete for a promotion, and you understand that the promotion is a title. The title is a status marker. The status marker is a tool for attracting mates and resources. The mates and resources are biological imperatives, and the biological imperatives are the prison's engine running on autopilot. None of them chose this wanting. They are acting out a script written by evolution and culture, and they believe the script is their own authentic desire. You see a couple argue about whose turn it is to take out the trash, and you understand that the argument is not about trash. It is about whose needs get prioritized, which is about whose value is greater, which is about power, which is about fear of abandonment, which is about childhood attachment wounds, which is about the fact that two separate nervous systems are trying to coexist in artificial proximity, and both are running ancient threat detection software that cannot tell the difference between emotional neglect and physical danger. You see someone post a carefully curated photo on social media, and you understand that they are not sharing a moment. They are constructing an identity, seeking validation, attempting to prove to themselves and others that their life has value according to metrics they did not choose and do not actually believe in, but cannot escape because the need for social belonging is hardwired deeper than conscious thought. And you see all of this with compassion, not contempt, because you recognize that you are doing the same thing. You're also acting out scripts. You're also performing roles. You're also running old programming. The only difference is that you can see it happening. And the seeing changes everything. It creates a gap, a space between stimulus and response, between feeling and identification, between the arising of desire and the belief that the desire is you. This gap is freedom, but it is also exile. Because now you cannot talk to people the way you used to. They speak about their problems as if the problems are ultimate. They speak about their goals as if achievement will finally satisfy. They speak about their identities as if identity is solid rather than constructed, and you cannot tell them otherwise, because they are not ready to hear it. And even if they were ready, your telling them would not help. Gnosis cannot be transmitted through words. It can only be recognized through direct experience. So you stay silent, you listen, you nod, you offer practical support where you can. But the deep conversation, the one about the fundamental nature of reality, the one about whether any of this matters, the one about the fact that we are all going to die and no achievement will survive the heat death of the universe, that conversation has no place in ordinary social interaction. You learn to translate. When someone says, "I'm worried about the presentation tomorrow," you do not say, "The presentation is a performance within a professional context, which is itself a constructed game that will be completely forgotten within a century." You say you'll do great, you've prepared well. You meet people where they are, because that is kindness, but the meeting is lonely, because you are no longer where they are. The Gnostics called this the solitude of the awakened one. Not the dramatic solitude of a hermit on a mountain, but the quiet solitude of being surrounded by people who cannot see what you see. It is not that you think you are better, it is that you are operating from a different framework. and frameworks are not compatible. You can translate between them, but you cannot occupy both simultaneously. Some people sensing this gap will pull away from you. You will make them uncomfortable in ways they cannot articulate. You will ask questions they do not want to answer. You will not react to things the way you are supposed to react. You will not be predictable. And predictability is the foundation of social trust. When someone becomes unpredictable, they become unsafe, not dangerous, but uncertain. And uncertainty triggers the ancient mammalian nervous system imperative. If I cannot predict you, I cannot trust you. If I cannot trust you, I need to distance myself from you. So you lose friends, not through conflict, but through drift. Invitations stop coming. Conversations become superficial. The bond dissolves not with a bang, but with a slow, quiet detachment. And you understand why. You're no longer playing the game with full investment. And people can sense that. They can feel that part of you has left the room, even though your body remains. This is the loneliness of seeing. You're surrounded by people, but you are not surrounded by recognition. No one sees what you see. No one confirms your experience. No one can hold space for the realization that everything is simultaneously meaningful and meaningless, both sacred and absurd, both beautiful and horrifying. You start to doubt yourself. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I should just relax and enjoy life. Maybe the people who are not asking these questions are happier. Maybe ignorance really is bliss, and this is the temptation, the seductive pull back into the comfort of shared illusion. There's a scene in The Matrix where Cypher, one of the rebels, makes a deal to be reinserted into the simulation. He sits across from Agent Smith in a fancy restaurant, which is itself part of the Matrix, and eats a steak. He knows the steak is not real. He knows the restaurant is not real. He knows that his senses are being manipulated by a computer program. Ignorance is bliss, he says, and he means it. He has chosen comfort over truth, pleasure over freedom, the simulation over reality. The scene is presented as a betrayal, and it is. But it is also an entirely rational choice given the circumstances. Life in the real world, on the hovercraft, eating nutrient slop, fighting machines, perpetually at risk of death, is objectively worse in almost every measurable way than life in the Matrix, even if the Matrix is a lie. So why not choose the lie? This is the question that haunts everyone who wakes up. Because waking up does not make you happy. It makes you aware. An awareness of a trap does not automatically provide a way out of the trap. At times it just makes the trap more unbearable. You still have to pay rent. You still have to eat. You still have to navigate social systems that you now recognize as arbitrary and absurd. You still have to perform the rituals of normalcy even though you no longer believe in their meaning. The only difference is that now you know, and the knowing is not particularly useful. It does not make you more successful. It does not make you more loved. It does not make your life easier. In many ways, it makes your life harder. Because you've lost the consolations that keep most people functional. You've lost the belief that hard work will be rewarded. You have lost the hope that love will last. You have lost the faith that there is a plan, a purpose, a reason for the suffering. And in exchange for those losses, you have gained what exactly? Clarity? What good is clarity if clarity just makes you sad? This is the temptation to go back to sleep, to choose deliberate amnesia, to re-enter the dream, and it is a real choice. You can do it. You can decide to stop asking questions. You can throw yourself back into your career, your relationships, your hobbies. You can manufacture meaning through sheer force of will. You can fake it until you make it. And eventually the faking becomes indistinguishable from the real thing. Many people do exactly this. They wake up, they see the cage, and then they consciously choose to ignore what they have seen. They reinvest in the game. They adopt a philosophy of pragmatic nihilism. Nothing matters, so I might as well enjoy myself. Or pragmatic optimism, nothing matters, so I might as well create my own meaning. Both of these are strategies for making the cage tolerable, and there is nothing wrong with them. They are functional, they allow you to continue participating in life without being crushed by existential dread, but they are not gnosis, they are management strategies, and they are ways of coping with the trap, not ways of escaping it. The Gnostic path is different. It does not say nothing matters, so enjoy yourself. It says, the material world is a trap, but you are not material. Your divine awareness temporarily confined in flesh. And your task is not to make the cage comfortable. Your task is to remember what you are and disentangle from what you are not. This is much harder, because it requires you to maintain the awareness of the trap while not being consumed by despair. It requires you to participate in the world without being of the world. It requires you to care about people and outcomes and beauty and love, while simultaneously recognizing that all of it is temporary, all of it is constructed, and none of it will survive. This is the razor's edge. Fall to one side and you become nihilistic, detached, numb. Fall to the other side and you become reabsorbed into the dream, functional but asleep. The middle path, awake but not despairing, engaged but not attached, is almost impossibly narrow. Most people cannot walk it for long, they veer one way or the other. But a few manage, not because they are stronger or smarter or more disciplined, but because something in them refuses to accept either option. They cannot go back to sleep because the knowing is too strong, and they cannot give up because something in them, the divine spark, the inner light, the fragment of Sophia, will not allow despair to be the final answer. So they keep walking, not toward a destination because there is no destination, but away from the false solutions, away from the easy answers, away from the temptations to either re-enter the dream or sink into hopelessness. And in that walking, something shifts. You cannot leave the world, you have a body. The body needs food, water, shelter. It needs sleep. It needs to be maintained. These are non-negotiable facts of incarnation. But you can leave identification with the world. You can stop believing that the roles you play are who you are. You can stop confusing the character with the actor. This is what the Gnostics meant by the internal exodus. Not a physical escape, but a perceptual shift. You're still in the same place, interacting with the same people, performing the same tasks, but the center of gravity has moved. Before, you were inside the experience, identified with it, believing that your thoughts were you, your emotions were you, your story was you. Now there is a part of you that is watching, not judging, not analyzing, just observing. And that observing part is not touched by what it observes. Your body feels pain, but the awareness of pain is not in pain. Your mind feels fear, but the awareness of fear is not afraid. Your identity feels threatened, but the awareness of identity is not threatened. This observing awareness is what the Gnostics called the divine spark. It is not something you develop, it is something you are. You just forget it most of the time because you're so completely fused with the content of experience. The internal exodus is the slow, patient work of disidentifying, of creating space between the watcher and the watched, of recognizing that you are not the character in the story, you're the space in which the story appears. This does not make you indifferent. You still care about people, you still feel love, grief, joy, anger. But you are not owned by those feelings. They arise, they peak, they pass, and you remain. In practical terms, this looks like a kind of radical ordinariness. You do your job, but you are not your job. You have relationships, but you are not defined by those relationships. You experience pleasure and pain, but you do not cling to the pleasure or resist the pain with the same desperate intensity. People around you may not notice any change. You are still functional, still kind, still engaged. But inside, the whole structure has shifted. The world is still the world, but you are no longer convinced that the world is reality. This is where the Gnostic framework diverges sharply from nihilism. The nihilist says nothing matters, so why bother? The Gnostic says The material world is not ultimate reality, but is the place where you are having an experience, and that experience can be met with awareness and compassion. You can care about things without being attached to outcomes. You can love people without needing them to be different than they are. You can engage with the world without believing that the world is all there is. This is not detachment in the sense of coldness. It is detachment in the sense of freedom. You are free to care precisely because you are not desperately clinging. You are free to love precisely because you are not afraid of loss. You are free to act precisely because you are not attached to results. The Stoic philosophers had a version of this. The Buddhists have a version of this. The Taoists have a version of this. The specific language and cosmology differ, but the core insight is the same. Suffering comes from attachment, and liberation comes from seeing through attachment without becoming indifferent. But the Gnostic version adds something the others do not emphasize as strongly: the recognition that the system itself is hostile, that the material world is not neutral ground where you work out your karma or cultivate virtue. It is an actively deceptive structure designed to keep you locked in identification. This means that the work of awakening is not just personal development, it is resistance. Not violent resistance, not political resistance in the conventional sense, but ontological resistance. You're refusing to grant the system the legitimacy it claims. You're refusing to play by rules you did not agree to. You are reclaiming your sovereignty from forces that have no right to it. And this reclamation does not require permission. You do not need to wait for the system to approve. You do not need to achieve a certain level of purity or wisdom or status. You simply withdraw your consent. The system will continue. The archons will continue. The material world will continue. But you are no longer feeding it with your belief. You are no longer reinforcing the cage by treating it as inevitable. This is the internal exodus. Not a destination, but a direction. Not a place you arrive, but a stance you maintain. And it leads to the final question. Every major religion offers some version of rescue. In Christianity, Jesus returns and establishes the kingdom of heaven. In Islam, the Mahdi appears and restores justice. In Hinduism, Kalki arrives and ends the Kali Yuga. In Buddhism, Maitreya descends and teaches the final Dharma. The details differ, but the structure is the same. Things are bad now, but a savior is coming. Hold on, be faithful, wait. The Gnostic position is, no one is coming. This is not cruelty, this is clarity. There is no external force that will fix the world. There is no divine intervention that will suddenly make the material system less hostile. There is no collective awakening on the horizon where everyone simultaneously sees through the illusion and the trap dissolves. The trap is structural. It is built into the nature of matter, time, and desire. It will not be reformed. It will not be healed. It will continue to operate exactly as it is designed to operate until the material cosmos itself ends. And when it ends, it will likely just begin again. Because the demiurge, the archons, the systemic forces that generate and maintain the material world, they're not going anywhere. They are part of the architecture. So if you are waiting for rescue, you will wait forever. This is the hardest teaching, because humans are wired to seek rescue. It is a survival strategy that worked for millions of years. When you're in danger, you call for help. And often help comes. Your tribe, your family, your friends, someone intervenes. But the Gnostic claim is that there is no external tribe for this particular problem. The problem is existence itself within the material framework. And no one can solve that problem for you. You have to do it yourself. Not through effort, not through achievement, not through moral perfection or spiritual practice. Those things may help create the conditions for awakening, but they do not cause awakening. Awakening is a recognition, not an accomplishment. And the recognition is simply this: you are not what you think you are. You are not the body, the mind, the personality, the story. You are the awareness in which all of those things appear. That awareness is not created by the material world. It is not subject to the material world's rules. It does not age. It does not suffer. It does not die. It is what the Gnostics called the pneuma, the spirit, the divine breath, the fragment of the yiptul pleroma that remains within you despite your incarnation in matter. And that fragment cannot be destroyed. It can be forgotten, obscured, ignored, but it cannot be destroyed because it was never created by the demiurge in the first place. This is the ultimate safety. Not that you will be rescued, but that the deepest part of you is never actually in danger. The body will die, the personality will dissolve, the story will end. But the awareness that witnessed all of it will remain because it exists outside of time. This is not a comforting teaching in the conventional sense. It does not promise that everything will be okay. It does not promise that your loved ones will be spared suffering. It does not promise that justice will prevail or that meaning will be restored. It only promises that you are not what you think you are, and that what you actually are is indestructible. But recognizing this requires you to let go of every identity you've ever clung to. Every role, every relationship, every story about who you are and what you need and what will make you safe. You have to die before you die. Not physically, but psychologically. You have to allow the constructed self to dissolve, and that dissolution feels like annihilation. It is not annihilation. It is liberation. But from the inside, from the perspective of the ego that is dissolving, the two are indistinguishable. So no saviour is coming, because the saviour is already here. It is the part of you that is watching these words, the part that exists prior to thought, the part that is aware of being aware. That part does not need to be saved, it only needs to be recognized, and recognition is entirely your responsibility. Let us be precise about what is lost. You lose the comfort of certainty. You can no longer be sure of anything except the fact of awareness itself. Everything else, every belief, every assumption, every model of reality becomes provisional. This is destabilizing. You lose the security of belonging. When you stop participating in collective illusions, you no longer fit into the groups that are organized around those illusions. This means you lose community, you lose social support, you lose the warm feeling of being part of something larger than yourself. You lose the consolation of narrative. The story of your life, the hero's journey, the arc of progress, the meaning you have constructed around your suffering, that story becomes transparent. You see it as a story, which means it can no longer provide the same sense of purpose it once did. You lose the certainty of morality. When you recognize that moral systems are constructed to serve social stability rather than revealed by divine authority, you lose the ability to be righteously certain about right and wrong. You can still act ethically, but you do it from a different place, from compassion and awareness, rather than from obedience to rules. You lose the hope of permanence. Every relationship, every achievement, every moment of beauty, you see it as temporary. You see the ending embedded in the beginning. This does not make beauty less beautiful, but it makes it bittersweet. Everything is already goodbye. You lose the distraction of future salvation. If there is no heaven waiting, no rescue coming, no ultimate justice that will set everything right, then there is only this moment, this breath, this experience. And you have to be present to it without the comfort of believing that it is all leading somewhere better. These are real losses, not theoretical, not abstract. When you wake up, you grieve. You grieve the loss of the world you thought you lived in. You grieve the loss of the person you thought you were. You grieve the loss of the future you thought was inevitable. And no one can grieve for you. No one can hold space for this particular grief because most people are still inside the dream. They cannot understand what you are mourning because they do not see what has been lost. So you grieve alone. But here is what you gain. You gain presence. When you are no longer constantly seeking, no longer constantly running toward future satisfaction or away from present discomfort, you become available to what is actually happening. And what is actually happening is far stranger and more beautiful than the stories you were telling about it. You gain authenticity. When you are no longer performing a role to maintain social approval, you become free to simply be. This does not mean you become rude or inconsiderate. It means you stop pretending. You stop forcing yourself to care about things you do not care about. You stop laughing at jokes that are not funny. You stop agreeing with things you do not believe. You gain sovereignty. When you recognize that no external authority has legitimate power over your inner life, you become the author of your own experience, not the author of circumstances. Those are still largely beyond your control. So the author of your response to circumstances, and that is the only freedom that actually matters. You gain clarity. The world does not become simpler, but it becomes more transparent. You see the mechanisms, you see the patterns, you see how desire generates suffering, how identification generates vulnerability, how attachment generates fear. And seeing these things allows you to move through them with less friction. You gain compassion. When you recognize that everyone is trapped in the same system, that everyone is running the same programs, that everyone is suffering from the same fundamental confusion about what they are, judgment becomes impossible. You see people struggling and you feel compassion, not pity, which is condescending, but genuine empathy. You have been where they are. You're still where they are in many ways. The only difference is that part of you sees it. And finally you gain humour. Because once you see the absurdity of the whole game, the seriousness with which people pursue goals that will not matter in 100 years, the intensity with which they defend identities that are entirely constructed, the passion with which they argue about whose simulation is more real, it becomes impossible not to laugh. Not cruel laughter, not mocking laughter, but the laughter of recognition, the cosmic joke, the revelation that you have been searching everywhere for something that was never lost. You are the thing you were looking for. You always have been, and the entire quest, the entire struggle, the entire drama of seeking and suffering and striving, it was always just awareness playing hide and seek with itself. The game is still happening, the world is still the world, the trap is still the trap, but you are no longer only trapped. Part of you has already escaped, and that part is watching the rest of you continue to play the game, and it is smiling. Because it knows how the game ends. It knows that every path leads eventually to the same recognition. It knows that the demiurge cannot win because the demiurge is fighting an enemy that does not exist. The divine spark was never truly captive. It only thought it was. And the moment it stops thinking it is captive, the cage disappears, not the material world. The material world continues. But the power it had over you, the weight it carried, the ultimate reality you assign to it, that disappears. What remains is awareness, aware of itself, playing in matter, temporarily, without attachment, without fear. This is the cost of waking up. Everything you thought was real becomes a game. Everything you thought was important becomes optional. Everything you thought was you becomes transparent. And in exchange, you gain yourself. Not the constructed self, the actual self, the one that was there before the story began and will be there after the story ends, the one that cannot be broken because it was never made, the one that is reading these words right now. There is no dramatic moment, no fireworks, no cosmic battle between light and dark. You do not ascend to heaven in a beam of light. You do not dissolve into pure energy. You do not merge with the One in a climactic moment of transcendence. You just stop believing the story. One day you are washing dishes and you notice that the hand washing the dish is not you. It is something you are aware of. The thought, I am washing dishes, is also not you. It is something you are aware of. And the awareness itself, the thing that is aware of the hand and the thought, that has no qualities. It is not happy or sad, not located in space, not moving through time. It is just aware. And you realize that this awareness has been here the whole time. Before the first thought this morning, before the first breath, before the first memory. It was here before you were born, and it will be here after you die, and it is not personal, it is not yours, you do not possess it, you are it. This is not a special state, it is the ordinary state that has always been here, hidden by the constant noise of thinking, feeling, wanting, fearing. When the noise quiets, even for a moment, the awareness is revealed, not as something new, but as something that was always already the case. The dishes still need to be washed, the bills still need to be paid, the body still ages, the world still contains suffering. Nothing changes, and everything changes, because you are no longer inside the experience, identified with it, believing that your survival depends on it. You are the space in which the experience happens, and the space is not threatened by what happens in it. A room is not damaged when furniture is moved. The sky is not wounded when clouds pass. Awareness is not harmed by the content of awareness. This is the silent exit. Not an escape from the world, but a recognition that you were never contained by it in the first place. The Gnostics called this Gnosis, union with the One. But it is not a union in the sense of two things coming together. It is a recognition that there were never two things. There is only awareness, and awareness appearing as the world, and awareness appearing as the person who seems to be separate from the world. But the separation is appearance. It is functional, that you need a sense of self to navigate material reality, but it is not ultimate. And when you see through it, even for a moment, the whole structure loosens. You can still play the game. You can still care about people and outcomes. You can still work, love, create, struggle, but you are no longer imprisoned by the game, because you know it is a game. The archons lose their power the moment you stop believing in them. The demiurge loses its authority the moment you recognize it as derivative. The material world loses its grip the moment you see it as appearance rather than substance. None of this requires years of meditation or spiritual practice. It can happen in an instant, and then be forgotten in the next instant, and then remembered again. It is not a permanent state you achieve, it is a noticing that comes and goes, but each time it comes, the identification loosens a little more, the attachment weakens a little more, the fear diminishes a little more, until one day, maybe in this life, maybe in some other cycle, the noticing becomes continuous, and when that happens, you are free. Not free from the world, free within the world, the body still dies. But you are not the body. The mind still suffers. But you are not the mind. The person still plays their role. But you are not the person. You are the awareness in which all of this appears. And that awareness is what the Gnostics meant by the divine. Not a god in the sky. Not a being separate from you, but the ground of your own existence. The I am that is prior to every I am this or I am that. And that I am is the same I am that is reading these words in every other body, in every other mind, in every other moment. There is only one awareness, and it is wearing 7 billion masks, pretending very convincingly to be separate. The game is hide and seek, and you are it. You have been looking for yourself in every relationship, every achievement, every experience. And the joke is that you were never lost. You're the finder and the found, the seeker and the sought. And the moment you realize this, the seeking ends. Not because you found what you were looking for, but because you realized you were what you were looking for all along. The prison only exists while it is believed in. Stop believing and the bars dissolve. Not the world continues, the archons continue, the demiurge continues, but you are no longer bound by any of it, because you have remembered what you are, and what you are cannot be imprisoned, it can only pretend to be, and when the pretending stops, what remains is simple presence, aware, open, untouched by the drama, watching the play continue, smiling. The story goes on, but you are no longer only the character in the story, you're also the space in which the story appears, and the space is infinite, and the space is free, and the space is you. This is the Gnostic promise, not salvation after death, not rescue by an external force, not the reformation of the material world into something less hostile, just this. The recognition that you are already free, you just forgot. And remembering is available in every moment. Right now, in this breath, in this awareness, here.